All right, welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ashley Lance, who will be giving a paper today titled Rez Diff, Indigenous Philosophies and Ancient Thought. Ashley Lance is a second-year PhD student at the University of Cambridge. Her dissertation is on race and Aristotle. She's a Blue Lake Rancheria tribal member and Europe descendant. So it's my pleasure to hand things over to Ashley.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I want to quickly thank the organizers for putting this conference together, my co-panelists and the other speakers of this conference. And I just want to say that it's such a treat to not be the only Indigenous person in the Zoom room. While this is getting set up, I do just want to take a moment to begin with something that I'm trialing as sort of a reverse land acknowledgement. So having moved to the UK, I have been revisiting who and what I'm obligated to with the land that I'm on. So being in the UK, I feel the most obligated to recognize the bones of ancestors held at universities across the world and at institutions like the University of Cambridge. So next to me, I have a small offering and I would like to send my thoughts to those ancestors who are currently being held in these institutions. And I'd like to encourage everyone to check out ProPublica's NAGPRA page, which has indexed all the holdings of universities in the US as a way to sort of revisit your own obligations. So if you could go to the next slide, perfect. I'd like to begin this paper with a story. So this story is neither Wea or Yurok, but it features characters that resonate with the stories I was told as a child. And I think it might have something to offer in the following discussion. Brian Yahtzee Burkhart Cherokee tells a story at the beginning of his chapter entitled, What Coyote and Thales Can Teach Us. I'll admit what Burkhart suggests we're supposed to learn from it. The story begins. Coyote is wandering around in his usual way when he comes upon a prairie dog town. The prairie dogs laugh and curse at him. Coyote gets angry and wants revenge. The sun is high in the sky. Coyote decides he wants clouds to come. He's starting to hate the prairie dogs and so thinks about rain. Just then a cloud appears. Coyote says, I wish it would rain on me. And that is what happened. Coyote says, I wish there were rain at my feet. And that is what happened. I want the rain up to my waist, he then says. And that is what happened. The water continues to rise higher and higher as Coyote begins to think and speak about it. Before long, the whole land is flooded. I said that I would not reveal what we're supposed to learn from the story, but I will say why Burkhart begins with this. The story of Coyote is contrasted with the image of Thales in Plato's Theaetetus. If the Thales and the Theaetetus helps us illustrate what philosophy is for Plato, does the story of Coyote show us what it is not? I'll not be analyzing the comparisons of these two stories, but what I am interested is finding an answer to this question, what is philosophy? More specifically, why does it seem that scholars' anxieties around what doing ancient philosophy is lends itself to the assumption that there is no indigenous philosophy or philosophies? More plainly, this paper attempts to ask, is there indigenous philosophy? Should there be? And why? To do this, I'll begin by surveying some comparisons and remarks that have been made about indigenous philosophy in ancient philosophical contexts. Here, I mean modern ancient philosophers like Michael Freda's work on the history of philosophy. And if you could move to the next slide, please. I'll then consider what it means to be included or excluded from philosophy. Finally, I'll attempt to define philosophy in a way that I think might be inclusive of indigenous philosophies as well as ancient thought. I do want to make a brief note about my use of the term indigenous. So for the most part, when I use the word, I'll be referring to indigenous people from the North, Central, and South American contexts. This is not because I think this is the only claim to indigeneity, but because I'm speaking from the viewpoint as a North American indigenous person. I do want to point towards work being done on African philosophy, indigenous African philosophy, and indigenous philosophy in other areas of the world. So next slide. Am I doing philosophy? I've labeled it this because I've only ever asked myself this question in the context of ancient philosophy. So this section, as stated above, surveys the comments that have been made about the status of ancient philosophy in both the history of philosophy and the modern field. Specifically, I'll be pointing to moments where these discussants choose to include or exclude Indigenous, Native American, or even barbarian philosophy. My suggestion is that these small moments, sometimes obviously and sometimes not so obviously, reveal a slip, that whatever Indigenous philosophy might be, it's not philosophy at all. To begin with, I turn to Michael Freda's Historiography of Philosophy. This work, published in 2021, began as a lecture series held at Oxford between 1989 to 1990. In the lectures, Freda is concerned with the question of what ancient philosophers are doing. Is it doxography? Is it philosophy? What is the difference between a historical version of history of philosophy and a philosophical version of history of philosophy? What hangs on these questions is a worry that what we do in ancient philosophy might not actually be philosophy properly speaking. Here, I want to flag that this is a worry that will crop up in the rest of the sources I'll be examining, that even though the ancients seem to be doing philosophy, what modern scholars are doing might seem like something very different, something that attempts to track the intellectual history and context, but not something that is interested in providing and progressing answers to philosophical questions. Returning to Freda, his section on doxography is an attempt to rehabilitate the genre from the idea that is merely a collection of various philosophers' opinions, but rather can be a philosophical exercise in its own right. Freda analyzes the lengthy history of the genre, commenting on how it evolves. He isolates two trends: that doxography becomes more critical and more comprehensive. As proof, he gives the following example, and I quote, "And when we come to Brucker, we not only find ancient, medieval, and modern philosophy, but also barbarian philosophy, including the philosophy of the Native Americans. The philosophy of Native Americans gets subsumed under the general umbrella of barbarian philosophy. On the one hand, this counts Indigenous peoples as having philosophy, but the language surrounding this inclusion is not something to take lightly. Other philosophers interested in the question of what is philosophy and what is the history of philosophy specifically in the question have similar slips. Rorty, for instance, discusses what historians of philosophy want when applying anachronistic philosophic or scientific concepts. That is, they want the belief that past philosophers could be persuaded to accept modern differences on grounds that they would accept. So filling this out, he uses an example of an ideal Aristotle, an ideal Indigenous person, and I've changed the language on this to make it a little bit nicer, and a gulag guard. On what the Indigenous person can be brought to accept, according to Rorty, is the following. The ideal Indigenous person can eventually be brought to accept a description of himself as having cooperated in the continuation of a kinship system designed to facilitate the unjust economic arrangements of his tribe. These are explicit examples I would like to highlight, but it might serve us to look at a few implicit examples. For instance, consider the philosopher Levinus's remark, "I always say, but in private, that the Greeks in the Bible are all that is serious in humanity. Everything else is dancing." Or the inciting incident for Debauche's piece, "Can Non-Europeans Think?" An introductory comment preceding an opinion piece by Zizek, which reads, "There are many important and active philosophers today." Goes on to name philosophers on different continents, not to mention others working in Brazil, Australia, and China. A similar statement is also made in jest by Jonathan Barnes in his infamous article Bagpipe Music, which surveys the declining state of ancient philosophy, and I've chosen not to include. So what does reviewing these comments tell us? On the side of Freda and Rorty, there seems to be some type of concern with what is going on in ancient philosophy and its status as philosophy proper or merely history. Including Indigenous thought in doxographies, like the case Freda points to, is positive in some sense, but the idea that it is barbarian and other should give us pause. Rorty is, I think, more honest in his analysis. He does not even consider whether Indigenous people have thought, but goes ahead to conclude that any Indigenous way of life should be considered defective. Panning out to broader comments about who does philosophy and where it is done demonstrates the status of Indigenous philosophy is not just a foil ancient philosophers can point to, but something all philosophers should contend with seriously. So next slide, can I do philosophy? I've labeled this next section, can I do philosophy? And here I want to consider what it might mean to be included or excluded in philosophy. What is doing philosophy, and why is it important if I can do it? To put my cards on the table, I'm of the opinion that I can do philosophy, and more importantly, that I would be able to do philosophy even if I was not in ancient philosophy or a philosophy graduate program. However, I'll consider why wanting to say that I can do philosophy might be counterproductive to broader anti-colonial goals. So first, I want to define what philosophy from a Western perspective is. Maffei, and I just want to note that I'm using the language in the book. He also notes why Aztec might not be the best label to use, just because it is a broad category of people who shouldn't actually be put together in a broad way. In his work on Aztec metaphysics, introduces the distinction in this way. Contemporary Anglo-American and European academic philosophers routinely distinguish having a philosophy in the sense of holding an implicit worldview, ideology, or cosmovision from doing philosophy in the sense of self-consciously and critically reflecting upon and speculating about the nature, structure, and constitution of reality, the nature of truth, the nature of right or wrong, the possibility of human knowledge, the meaning of life, and so on. What having philosophy is, and who has a philosophy, according to Maffei, is the sole invention and possession of Western culture, beginning with the Socratics and the Sophists. Maffei goes on to call this specific version of philosophy club philosophy, and using Leon Portia's groundbreaking work, note on the slides the switch in the translation from philosophia to thought and culture. Navigating membership in club philosophy might go one of two ways. They may seek admission into the club by arguing that what they do sufficiently resembles what bona fide club members do. Leon Portia pursues the strategy on behalf of the Aztecs, or they may reject the philosophy versus non-philosophy binary, along with the entire debate as a now discredited, self-serving relic of Western colonialism, racism, modernism, paternalism, etc. Not worry about whether or not what they do qualifies as real philosophy and continue doing what they've always been doing. Next slide, please. There are many examples for the case of pursuing, even within the realms of ancient philosophy. So for instance, Barry Helen asks why African philosophy is not treated or mentioned in ancient philosophy courses and scholarships. It could also be the case that arguing for the inclusion of Nawa or Mayan philosophies in ancient philosophy courses or editions might fit. I'll return to this suggestion towards the end of this paper. Other projects, like the late Charles Mills' argument for a Black philosophy, also seems to argue for membership in club philosophy, but it might be the case that his argument for what philosophy is philosophy in a qualified way. But for both, the label philosophy becomes important to being able to accurately describe what type of thinking is going on and to translate that thinking outside of its own members. So what's the case for rejecting membership? We might return to Debashi, who criticized the philosophy in the previous section. Debashi's response to these remarks were to question the claims to universality and the, quote, self-conscious confidence that comes with the Euro-American philosophy. Debashi asks why Zizek and Butler and others get labeled as philosophers, or the very least public intellectuals, while modern philosophy in Cuba, China, India, and other areas gets, if at all, prefixed with ethno, i.e. ethno-philosophy. In other words, the approach Debashi takes in this article and his later book is why exactly non-Western areas are not even given the prefix thinking and the limitations that has for Euro-Americans. Instead of arguing for Euro-American philosophy to accommodate non-European philosophy, Debashi reframes the debate. Quote, the question is rather the manner in which non-European thinking can reach self-conscious and evident universality, not at the cost of whatever European philosophers may think of themselves for the world at large, but for the purpose of offering alternative, complementary, or contradictory visions of reality more rooted in the lived experiences of people in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. Next slide, please. So the final part of my talk, I am doing philosophy. I label this because I'd like to get to sort of more of a definition of philosophy that I think can accommodate some of these criticisms. So the two approaches to club philosophy, that is pursuing or rejecting membership, reveal a lot about what kinds of claims are made about Western philosophy. Western or Euro-American philosophy has that confidence, Debashi notes. Even Rorty claims that the title of philosophy is less about thinking or thought, but more of an honorific title or epithet. Maffei, by including Socrates, Plato, and the Sophists, participates in a specific type of narrative about philosophy and its history that has progressed past previous thought. If then a Western model of philosophy has these claims, that it is making universal claims by means of reason, that it has progressed, and that this is assuredly the case, can we make an account of doing philosophy not based on this? So I want to turn to V.F. Cordova's work on approaches to Native American philosophy. This is in the book American Indian Thought, and I just want to note that V.F. Cordova was one of the first Indigenous women to graduate with a PhD in philosophy in the United States. That was in 1997, a year after I was born. So lots of work still to do. Next slide, please. So Cordova, in approaches to Native American philosophy, is concerned with how we can explain differences in other contexts. Namely, what could a non-Native philosopher get out of Native philosophy and how to do that philosophically. She lays out 3 underlying assumptions that Western philosophers are making when dealing with Native philosophy. The first, quote, the view that all human beings are operating on a common theme. 2, that non-Western peoples are a less complex form of being, less developed than Westerners. And 3, that Indigenous peoples are incapable of engaging in philosophical discussions. We have seen, I think, all 3 assumptions laid out in previous discussions: the confidence of Western philosophy, the assumptions about Indigenous way of life, and the less insensitive inclusion of Native philosophy as barbarian. Cordova does propose solutions to these assumptions. In the first case, the solution is to move away from comparison and to move away from looking for a common theme. This leads immediately to the solution for 2. She notes that the act of looking for something in common or saying this is like that often slips from equitable comparison to this is a less developed form of that. So for Cordova, rejecting this approach is key. Here is where I want to return to the question of Indigenous philosophy as being taught with ancient philosophy. I think that the want to do this is partially because many Indigenous philosophies are ancient and represent a long line of thinking. However, I think this does not quite address what happens when comparing the 2, not least because the moniker of ancient denies Indigenous presence and futures, which is especially important to emphasize given that 40% of Americans think that Native Americans don't exist at all. I think Cordova is right that it is easy for people to slip from an open comparison to this is a less developed form of that comparison, not the least because Indigenous knowledge is already epistemically marginalized. What good does it do to put Indigenous philosophy in the past, allowing all the assumptions that we have surpassed and progressed from these views? I don't have much more to say on this, but I am looking forward to maybe a discussion about how to fit ancient philosophy and Indigenous philosophy together. So continuing on these assumptions, the solution to 1 is to reject this is like that approach. The solution to 3 is a simple denial. Next slide, please. Cordova details a moment speaking with a fluent Anishinaabe speaker. He gave me the little translation as tread carefully. Some, he said, interpreted this as be careful, but he pointed out it means much more than that. Unspoken but understood in that word is a whole worldview having to do with humans' place and effect on the universe. From my own experience, I discovered that many of our family discussions around the kitchen table consisted of very sophisticated philosophical dialogue. We did not use the language of philosophers, the activity and the intent were the same. So returning to the question of philosophy, the philosophical endeavor should extend its present perspective to an attempt to understand all of the possible ranges of human thought. Imagine, for example, instead of a concept of progress, we had merely a concept of change, end quote. Last slide, please. So I want to end on this note, because I think the move from progress to change more accurately gets at what's at stake when we are discussing philosophy, and especially where to slot in things like ancient philosophy or Indigenous philosophy. Instead of evaluating how these areas affect the progress of thought, we might ask, how does doing philosophy change in this context? What are the differences? I don't know if this fully provides a satisfying answer to what doing philosophy is, but I think it provides a healthier, more humble starting point. I think this helps me get to what I most want to claim. That is, I don't know if I've made an argument for whether or not modern ancient philosophy is philosophy. And I also don't know if that matters, but I do think I've made an argument for why Indigenous philosophy is philosophy. And that is something I, and maybe we can do outside of philosophy faculty or department, or even on a reservation at a dinner table. Thank you.